The United States holds more elections than almost any country in the world. Presidential races, congressional contests, state and local elections unfold continuously, making voting not an occasional event, but a permanent condition of American political life. Alongside this electoral density exists one of the freest media environments on Earth. Political power is scrutinized publicly, leaders are criticized daily, and institutional conflict plays out in full view of society. Few systems tolerate this level of visibility and dissent. By conventional definitions, these features should place the United States firmly within the category of a functioning democracy. Yet, a persistent contradiction remains. A majority of Americans believe that their government does not represent them. They participate in elections, but policy trajectories remain largely unchanged. They alternate parties in power, yet outcomes continue along familiar paths. This is not political indifference. It is engagement without meaningful control. Participation exists, but influence appears limited. The question, therefore, is not whether the United States holds elections. It is whether elections translate into power over outcomes. If citizens formally participate, but decisive decisions consistently align with the interests of a narrow minority, the democratic character of the system becomes less certain. This video does not argue that American democracy has collapsed, nor does it describe the system as authoritarian. It raises a more unsettling possibility, that the system may not be failing at democracy at all, but rather functioning exactly as designed, according to a far narrower definition of what democracy is meant to be. To understand why elections in the United States so often fail to produce a sense of representation, it is necessary to step away from campaigns and ballots and return to a more basic question: what democracy is meant to do? At its simplest, democracy is defined as rule by the people. Abraham Lincoln's formulation, government of the people, by the people, for the people, remains the most widely accepted expression of that idea. What is often missed is that these definitions say nothing about elections themselves. They describe outcomes, not procedures. Democracy is not defined by how frequently citizens vote, but by whether their collective preferences meaningfully shape political decisions. This distinction matters because modern political systems tend to treat elections as the culmination of democracy rather than its entry point. Voting becomes the proof of legitimacy, even when it has little influence over policy direction. Empirical research reinforces this gap. A large-scale study by scholars at Princeton University, examining nearly 2,000 U.S. policy decisions over several decades, found that when the preferences of average voters diverge from those of economic elites, policy outcomes overwhelmingly align with elite interests. Public opinion among the bottom 90% of earners showed little to no measurable impact on whether legislation passed. In other words, participation alone does not equal power. This leads to one of the most persistent misconceptions in democratic societies: the belief that regular elections automatically ensure democratic control. Elections can coexist with highly unequal influence, just as formal participation can exist alongside structural exclusion. Democracy, at its core, is a system for allocating power. It determines whose preferences prevail when interests collide, and whose are absorbed without effect. When that allocation consistently favors a narrow segment of society, the presence of elections becomes less decisive than the distribution of influence surrounding them. The defining question, then, is not whether citizens are allowed to vote. It is what happens when their votes conflict with concentrated wealth, institutional power, or entrenched economic interests. Once that question is asked, elections stop looking like a sufficient definition of democracy and start looking like only one part of a far more constrained system. If democracy is ultimately judged by whether public preferences shape policy, then the American case must be examined not through rhetoric, but through outcomes. This is where the contradiction becomes difficult to ignore. Over the past several decades, political scientists have attempted to measure a simple relationship. When Americans want something to happen, how often does it actually happen? One of the most influential answers comes from a large-scale study conducted by researchers at Princeton University, who examined nearly 2,000 U.S. policy decisions over more than 20 years. Their findings revealed a striking imbalance. When the preferences of the bottom 90% of Americans shifted from strong opposition to strong support, the likelihood of a policy being adopted barely changed. Public opinion among the majority showed little to no measurable impact on legislative outcomes. By contrast, when the preferences of the top 10% changed, policy outcomes followed closely. As support among high-income Americans increased, so did the probability that a policy would become law. This difference was not marginal, it was structural, and it was consistent across policy areas. To understand what this means beyond statistics, consider a familiar example. For years, polling has shown that a clear majority of Americans support allowing Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices directly with pharmaceutical companies. In many surveys, support exceeded 70% and cut across party lines. Yet, for decades, such proposals failed to pass, not because voters opposed them, but because the pharmaceutical industry spent hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying against them, consistently outspending nearly every other sector in Washington. A similar pattern can be seen in debates over the federal minimum wage. Large majorities of Americans have supported raising it for years, yet Congress allowed it to stagnate for more than a decade, even as productivity rose and corporate profits reached record levels. Public support was visible and persistent. Policy change was not. These outcomes are often described as partisan gridlock or institutional dysfunction. But taken together, they point to something more stable. When mass public preferences collide with concentrated economic power, the latter tends to prevail. This helps explain a sentiment that has become deeply ingrained in American political culture. Yet many citizens say that voting does not change anything, that both parties ultimately serve the same interests, and that politics has little to do with people like them. These reactions are frequently dismissed as apathy or cynicism. In reality, they reflect learned experience. When participation repeatedly fails to produce meaningful change, disengagement becomes a rational response rather than a moral failing. Over time, citizens internalize the limits of their influence. They are encouraged to participate, but rarely empowered to decide. This is how a system can remain procedurally democratic while generating widespread disillusionment. The problem is not that people stop caring. It is that the structure of power teaches them where their participation ceases to matter. And once that lesson is learned, dissatisfaction no longer looks like a crisis of civic culture, but a predictable consequence of how democracy operates in the United States. If the gap between public preferences and policy outcomes is real, then the next question becomes unavoidable. How is that gap sustained over time? This is where money enters the picture, not as a scandal, but as a structural feature. Modern American elections are extraordinarily expensive. In the 2024 election cycle alone, total federal campaign spending approached $16 billion. Running for national office now requires continuous fundraising at a scale that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Advertising, staff, compliance, data operations, and permanent campaigning have transformed politics into a full-time financial operation. Unlike many democracies, the United States provides little meaningful public funding for national campaigns. Candidates are expected to finance their political viability through private sources. As a result, financial dependency is not an exception. It is the baseline. The costs illustrate the problem clearly. A competitive U.S. Senate race now costs, on average, more than $25 million, over 6 times what it cost in the early 1990s. Presidential campaigns operate on an entirely different scale, with billions spent long before Election Day. Few individuals can access this level of funding without institutional backing. This is where large donors, super PACs, and lobbying organizations become central. While individual citizens are legally limited to donating a few $1,000s directly to a campaign, a single super PAC can raise and spend hundreds of millions of dollars in support of, or opposition to, a candidate. Lobbying organizations, meanwhile, spend billions each year to maintain permanent influence in Washington, ensuring that policy discussions never occur in a financial vacuum. These mechanisms are often described as distortions of democracy, but that framing misses something important. Money did not break American democracy. It moved through channels that already existed. The system was built around representation rather than direct rule. Political authority is mediated through institutions that require constant resources to operate. In such an environment, influence naturally concentrates around those who can sustain access, attention, and leverage over time. Wealth does not override the system from the outside. It amplifies itself within it. This is why efforts to reform campaign finance rarely transform outcomes. Limits are imposed, loopholes are discovered, and new vehicles emerge. The form of money changes, but its role does not. As long as political power depends on institutions that demand continuous funding, those with resources will retain disproportionate influence. Seen this way, money in American politics is not the root cause of democratic imbalance. It is a symptom of a deeper design, one in which popular participation is encouraged, but decisive power is filtered upward. The system does not malfunction when money dominates politics. It behaves predictably, and as long as the underlying structure remains intact, financial power will continue to sit at the center of political decision-making, regardless of reform efforts. To understand why money, influence, and elite preference consistently outweigh mass opinion in the United States, it is necessary to go further back than campaign finance law. The roots of the problem lie not in recent corruption, but in the original design of the system itself. When the United States was founded, democracy was not the primary objective. Stability was. Order was. And above all, protection from what many of the founders viewed as the dangers of direct popular rule. The architects of the American system were not revolutionaries seeking to maximize democratic participation. They were elites attempting to contain it. This fear was explicit. Figures like James Madison, often celebrated as champions of liberty, openly argued that unchecked majority rule posed a threat to property, order, and long-term governance. In the Federalist Papers, Madison defended representative government precisely because it would filter public opinion, refining and enlarging the public view through a select group of citizens. Representation, in this logic, was not a tool to empower the masses. It was a mechanism to restrain them. This design principle shaped every major institution of the American system. The goal was not to translate public will directly into policy, but to slow it down, fragment it, and pass it through multiple layers of review. What emerged was not a direct democracy, but a carefully balanced structure of filters. The United States Senate was one of the most important of these filters. Unlike the House, it was designed to represent states rather than population, granting disproportionate influence to less populous regions. Its longer terms and smaller membership insulated senators from short-term public pressure, reinforcing stability over responsiveness. The Electoral College serves a similar function. Presidents are not elected by a national popular vote, but through an intermediary body that amplifies certain states and diminishes others. This system was explicitly designed to buffer the selection of executive power from direct mass influence. The judiciary represents the most insulated filter of all. The Supreme Court of the United States, with lifetime appointments and no electoral accountability, holds the power to override legislation supported by large majorities. Its purpose is not to reflect the public opinion, but to constrain it within constitutional boundaries defined centuries ago. These institutions are often discussed as imperfections or outdated relics, but that framing misunderstands their role. They are not malfunctions. They are functioning exactly as intended. The American system was never designed to ask what the majority wants and then enact it. It was designed to ask whether majority demands could be safely absorbed without threatening existing power structures. Democracy, in this context, was deliberately limited, not eliminated, but contained. This does not mean the system is illegitimate. It means it operates under a narrower conception of democracy than many assume. Elections exist. Participation is encouraged. But decision-making authority is distributed upward, filtered through institutions designed to resist rapid or expansive popular control. Once this structure is understood, many contemporary frustrations begin to make sense. The persistence of elite influence, the resilience of money in politics, and the difficulty of translating mass support into policy are not signs that the system is broken. They are signs that it is doing precisely what it was built to do. And this raises a far more uncomfortable question, not about corruption or reform, but about expectations. If democracy in the United States was never meant to be direct rule by the majority, then the real tension is not between ideals and reality, but between what people believe the system is and what it was designed to be. If American democracy is filtered through institutions, it ultimately comes to a halt in a place far more powerful than Congress or the courts: the workplace. In public life, Americans are citizens. They vote, debate, and are told that their consent legitimizes authority. But for most of their waking hours, they exist in a different system altogether, one governed by rules that bear little resemblance to democracy. The average American spends more than half of their adult waking life at work. Yet inside the workplace, democratic principles largely disappear. Workers do not elect their managers. They do not vote on corporate strategy, wage structures, or how profits are distributed. Decisions that shape their income, healthcare, schedules, and long-term security are made by a small group at the top, whose authority is based not on consent, but on ownership. This is not an edge case. It is the norm. More than 90% of American workers do not belong to a union. The overwhelming majority have no formal mechanism to negotiate wages, challenge management decisions, or influence company policy. In most U.S. states, employment is at will, meaning workers can be fired without cause, explanation, or due process. The result is a profound asymmetry of power. Outside the workplace, individuals are addressed as equals. Inside it, they are structurally subordinate. Compliance is not optional because livelihoods depend on it. This is where economic power becomes political power. Corporations do not need to run candidates to shape outcomes. They can influence politics indirectly by controlling investment, employment, and prices. Decisions to relocate factories, automate jobs, or freeze hiring can exert pressure on entire communities without a single vote being cast. In this way, economic authority operates continuously, while political participation remains episodic. A society structured this way cannot easily produce political equality. When power in everyday life flows downward from ownership, the promise of equal voice at the ballot box becomes limited in practice. Voting, once every few years, cannot counterbalance daily exposure to hierarchical control elsewhere. This is why political democracy struggles to extend beyond formal institutions. It is not merely constrained by law or procedure, but by the economic system that sustains it. When the most consequential decisions affecting people's lives are made in spaces beyond democratic reach, elections alone cannot correct the imbalance. In the American case, democracy does not vanish. It stops precisely at the point where power is most concentrated, where dependence is most acute, and where consent is replaced by necessity. Once democracy is filtered through institutions and comes to a halt at the workplace, a final question remains. If citizens are neither the primary decision-makers nor the holders of sustained power, then what role are they actually assigned within the system? They are not the ones who determine outcomes. Major policy directions are shaped long before ballots are cast, constrained by economic realities, institutional design, and elite consensus. Elections rarely decide what will be done. At most, they decide who will manage what has already been narrowed down. Instead, citizens perform a different function. They legitimize the system. Participation confers consent. Voting signals acceptance of the rules, even when the choices offered are limited. Turnout is interpreted as validation, not of specific outcomes, but of the process itself. In this way, elections transform structural constraints into democratic authorization. Citizens also provide stability. By channeling frustration into periodic voting, the system absorbs discontent without fundamentally redistributing power. Conflict is contained within acceptable boundaries, expressed through campaigns rather than sustained pressure on decision-making centers. And finally, citizens absorb the consequences. When policies fail, when inequality deepens, when economic shocks occur, the costs are distributed downward. Individuals adjust their lives by working longer hours, relocating, or accepting declining security, while the structures that produce those outcomes remain largely intact. The danger lies not in voting itself, but in misunderstanding what voting can realistically accomplish. When expectations exceed structural capacity, disappointment is inevitable. Cynicism follows not because people are irrational, but because the system consistently teaches them its limits. In the American case, democracy is not an illusion, it is a managed experience. Citizens are encouraged to participate, invited to debate, and permitted to choose, but rarely empowered to decide. Understanding this distinction does not require rejecting democracy. It requires redefining it, less as a promise of control and more as a framework that determines where control ends. There is another way to look at the American experience, one that avoids moral judgment and focuses instead on design. The United States may not have failed at democracy. It may have succeeded at limiting it. The system functions. Elections are held, power changes hands, institutions endure. What is often described as dysfunction may, in fact, be stability achieved through constraint. Democracy exists, but within carefully drawn boundaries. Seen this way, many familiar frustrations take on a different meaning. The persistence of elite influence, the resilience of money in politics, and the difficulty of translating majority support into policy are not anomalies. They are outcomes consistent with how the system was built to operate. If that is true, then the question is no longer whether American democracy is broken. The question becomes more uncomfortable. If the system is operating as designed, where should public anger be directed? Toward surface-level reforms that adjust procedures without altering power, or toward a deeper reassessment of what democracy is assumed to mean in the first place? Is the problem that democracy has been undermined, or that it was never intended to extend as far as many believe? Perhaps the most important question, then, is not whether the United States is a democracy. It is who is invited to participate in decision-making and who is structurally excluded from it. And once that question is asked, the answer is no longer political. It becomes structural.